We are going to get started. Hi, everyone. Nikki Hardy here, and today's Science Saturday is the science of composting techniques. So, a quick recap from what we talked about last week at the chemistry of composting is that we covered the science of how our food waste decomposes, and so the different chemical processes that are taking place with the decomposition of our food waste. We also talked about the importance of diverting food waste away from landfills. So I went into great detail as to the benefits of diverting our food waste away from landfills, especially as it pertains to greenhouse gases and the methane production that happens at landfills inadvertently, as well as the benefit of being able to feed our garden plants exactly what you know, right? And so you're giving your garden plants something that you know where it came from. We also covered a couple of terms you may or may not be familiar with. So that's putrefaction, which includes the gross decomposition of food and the generation of slime and stinky gases and everything that goes with putrefaction or to putrefy, as opposed to a controlled decomposition. And then we introduced the major concepts for residential composting. So this is specific to residential. There's a lot of different ways that we can compost at an industrial level, but that's not really within the scope of being able to do it in our homes or in our own backyards. So we talked about the difference between anaerobic, which is without air, versus air, which is with air, or aerobic, which is with air, and as that related to heaps. And then over on the other table, I have some worms, and then pickles, which is fermentation with Bokashi. And then we also introduced the concept of brown versus green material, because that's a really important thing as it pertains to composting in an air environment. All right. And one of the biggest takeaways, or hopefully one of the biggest takeaways, was that all composting techniques are microbial driven. And so this is actually a microscopic view of compost, and we have three big things worth mentioning. Up by the kind of pinkish purple arrow, we have yeast. Over here on the side, we have bacteria with the blue arrow, and then the filamentous fungi are highlighted with the green arrow. And let's see. Oh, I do end up having my arrow up there. And so composting isn't a one microbe makes it happen type thing. It takes a big, diverse community of microbes, and they all have different jobs, and they do those jobs very well, right? And so to have that diversity at the microbial level will ensure that you end up having a good compost heap. All right. So, what do you need to understand from that particular discussion leading into today's conversation? Well, first, we need to understand that the compostability of any given material is dependent on the macromolecular structure. All right, so those are some really big words, but effectively what this boils down to is that foods that are rich in proteins and fats are hard to break down, and they don't belong in a compost heap. And this actually should be something that kind of makes sense, because we always hear about how you shouldn't throw like your dairy in your compost heap, right? Because it's going to go bad. It's going to go rancid. That's one variety or one flavor of putrefaction. You shouldn't go through and throw that T-bone slab out in your compost heap, because it's not going to break down. And that has a lot to do with what it is made of. These are food materials that are very high in protein, very high in fat. And contrast that with like your banana peel. Your banana peel doesn't have much for protein, doesn't have much for fat. That's a pretty easy thing to break down. All right, so let's see. All right, yes. Okay, so then we also covered what these different, so down at the bottom, I have the three major macromolecules over on the, let's see, where did my, there it is. Over here on, I guess it would be your left, it is the carbohydrates. And so what we have presented is the chemical structure of a monosaccharide. And so this is just a simple sugar. In the middle, we have protein. So this is represented here by its building block, an amino acid. And over on what would be the right side then is the fats. And this is represented by single fatty acid here. And each one of those letters up there represents something different. And so those are the different elements. And so first we had carbon right here in the middle, and then we have hydrogen as H. We have oxygen as O, and we have nitrogen shown as N. And then we also have this R side chain down here, but that is actually a representation of many different combinations of elements because we have many different amino acids. The takeaway here isn't being able to understand necessarily what these macromolecules look like or, be able to write them down yourself, but to understand that they are very different and they're very different structurally, which also then impacts how they are broken down over time. And so our food is made up of macromolecules. We see it on the back side of our nutrition facts. So we have a space for carbohydrates to be listed and fats and protein, right? And so this is kind of what those are referring to. So our food is made up of different proportions of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And those carbohydrates, proteins, and fats influences how well it breaks down in a compost heap. All right, so that was kind of a lot, but hopefully it makes sense. Number two is that water is in fact essential for composting, though too much of a good thing actually becomes a bad thing. So we cannot oversaturate our compost heap because otherwise we push out all of the air. Well, composting, unless you're doing fermentation, composting is an aerobic process, meaning you need that air, but you also need to have water. And that's because one of the first steps is hydrolysis. And so that's actually the breaking down of the complex carbohydrates into its little building blocks, like the monosaccharides and the disaccharides or the simple sugars. And then we have the proteins that become hydrolyzed and form amino acids and peptides. And then we have our fats that are hydrolyzed and form fatty acids. And so hydro, this is one of the terms that we defined last week. Hydro refers to water and lysis is to break. So hydrolysis is using water to break something. All right. So number three, one of the major points that we need to know leading into today is that microbes drive the composting process. I cannot hammer this one home enough. It's something that a lot of people don't understand because it's not something that we can see. It's just something that we need to trust actually happens. But microbes are the ones that are driving this process. And it's important to understand that those microbes include the bacteria and the fungi. And then it's also important to consider the enzymes that the bacteria and the fungi produce, because those enzymes are the proteins that help speed up a process, including things like breaking down our big macromolecules into their little building blocks. All right, another important concept to wrap your head around is that different microbes do different things in different environments. And so here's those terms again. So aerobic with air, microbes that are aerobic microbes will function in a very classic way, very well understood scientifically. And this is the process of respiration. And so they'll break down these molecules in a very well, in a very well-known way. It's not something that our classic background or our classic backyard gardener needs to know, but it's a very well-documented, well-studied way, and that way is respiration. And then if we all of a sudden take air out of the picture, let's say that we have compaction that happens within the middle of our compost heap. The air has been removed. Well, the microbes that are there that may not have been active before, those may include anaerobic microbes, and they function in a very different way. And when we flip into that anaerobic, depending on the microbes that are present, that's when we end up moving towards putrefaction or fermentation. It just kind of depends on what the assortment is of the microbes that are present. And then we had this concept of facultative microbes, and these are microbes that can operate in air or in the lack of air. And these are the really cool ones because this is what we use for Bokashi fermentation. And so what we have here, I don't know if it's going to come up. I'll show the video in a little bit. We have a collection of microbes that are facultative microbes where in the presence of air, they operate with respiration. In the absence of air, they kick over into fermentation, which is exactly what we want when we're doing Bokashi fermentation. So it's a really neat process using some really cool bacteria. And one of them, I'll just kind of spill the beans early, is our lactobacillus, which may be familiar because those are also the microbes that are used in the production of yogurt. And so lactobacilli are used to ferment our yogurt to generate that, or ferment our milk product to generate yogurt. And it's also kind of the same idea with Bokashi. And so some of these microbes are doing really cool things in different situations. All right. So number four is just a basic understanding of the green and brown materials. So when we refer to green materials, we're referring to the nitrogen-rich sources. And so back a couple slides, we talked about nitrogen. Nitrogen is present in amino acids. Nitrogen should ring a bell saying, oh, hey, that's related to proteins. And so even our green materials are high in plant proteins, right? And so this is kind of what this is getting at is that the green materials are the ones that are high in plant proteins. And green materials are required for bacterial reproduction and enzyme production. Now, if you remember just a couple slides ago, enzymes are proteins. So it makes sense that bacteria need a source of protein to make their proteins. So they break down those proteins and then they can use them to best suit their needs to break down the compost, which is pretty cool. And then contrast that with brown. Our brown material is our carbon-rich sources. And carbon is essential for all of the biomolecules that are produced by our microbes. And those are our proteins, carbohydrates, and our fat. And then one of the most important functions for our brown material, especially in our aerobic setting, so our heap composting and our worm composting, is that it provides structure in our heap. And so that structure is important because if our heap collapses, then we push out all of the air and we switch from an aerobic setting to an anaerobic setting. So it pushes out all that air, and then all of a sudden you're going to end up with maybe the generation of slime, right? And so having brown material in there will provide that structure. It also provides energy for the microbes because any of these carbon-rich sources are very easy to, well, not easy, but they can be broken down to the simple sugars that microbes need in order to live, thrive, and multiply. And then the last one is that brown material can also act like a sponge. And so let's say that we wet down our compost pile. It's going to absorb some of that water and slowly release it over time, which is really important because hydrolysis is one of the first steps. So it all kind of plays together. So we need water in order to have an effective compost pile. And that brown material is what keeps that water and releases it slowly over time. And then the last tidbit about the green and the brown material is that as it pertains to aerobic composting, so once again, that's our heaps and our worms, there's a magic ratio, and that's 25 parts brown material or carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And this is something that seems like a lot, and it is. And this is where a lot of people have a hard time composting because if you generate too much, or if you generate too much green material and then you put it in your compost bin, what's going to happen is that it's going to push your compost over towards putrefaction. And so you're going to have to turn it a lot. You're going to have to try and add microbes to it, anything to kind of jump start it. Whereas if we were to add, like those leftover garden leaves or something else, some of those brown materials, that's when you can start to balance things out. All right, so I know that probably seemed like a lot. This is also a lot of information that people who have gardened before maybe didn't realize that they understand, because a lot of it is the stuff that, gardening is all about trial and error. And when we're gardening, when we're composting, you try certain things, right? And for me, that's what it was with composting. I was one of those people that did not understand that 25 part carbon to 1 part nitrogen and the things that you had to do in order to make sure that the composting actually happened. And so like this is a example of my own learning lessons in composting. And so, and I share that just because like that is a really hard thing, I think, for most people to understand is how much carbon you need to add to a traditional aerobic compost heap, right? Because it's a lot. Um, all right, so let us talk about what we're going to discuss for the rest of today. So we are going to go through those 3 major residential composting techniques. We're going to start with compost heaps, and then we're going to talk about Bokashi, and then we are going to talk about vermiculture, and finally, we're going to bring it all together as to the benefits of employing different composting techniques depending on your needs and the time of year. All right. And then last, we will talk about troubleshooting all of those techniques because I think that's also really important. All right. So getting started with our compost heaps, let's pile it on. All right, so once again, first major point is that traditional composting is driven by microbes. And so those, once again, are our bacteria, our fungi, and the enzymes that are produced by those bacteria and fungi. It is traditional heap composting is an aerobic technique, meaning that it requires additional input from a person to flip the heap. And so you need to be introducing air into your heap. And so that process is called turning, and that helps prevent compaction. Like I mentioned once before, once we hit compaction, all of that air has been forced out of the heap, and we start to drive our compost towards putrefaction instead of decomposition. All right, so traditional composting also requires heat, which is nice because the microbes are generating that heat through their breaking down of the compost itself. And that heat does an important job of inactivating pathogens. And so ideally, you want a nice steaming heap of compost that is at about 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually pretty challenging to do with most small compost heaps that people have in their backyard, but it is a good goal to get to. And there are long thermometers that are specially designed for compost heaps. Another thing with traditional composting is that it is slow. It's a slow process that can take many months to many years in order to fully break down. And up here in Minnesota, we're limited by our growing season. And so the goal with heap composting is that we need to start it right away in the spring. And then, we just kind of let it go right up until the fall. And as soon as that snow hits and the temperature starts to dive, well, the microbes that are within that heap are also being rendered inactive. They're not necessarily dying, but they are being rendered inactive. And so they stop with their composting abilities. And then additionally, a drawback for traditional composting is that there is limited input. So you can't put in animal products. You need to limit citrus, and that's because of the acids that are present in like citrus peels in particular. We need to limit onions, which are very high in sulfur. That's part of what makes a compost pile stink if you add onions to it. And then also the starches. And this has more to do with the critters. You really don't want to invite critters into your compost bin. I mean, like personally, I don't like to be surprised by critters. And then there's also a risk of introducing non-ideal microbes into your compost pit if you're adding too many starches. A compost pit can, in fact, handle a fair amount of starch, but it needs to be kind of balanced. And so it's not, every time you have pasta, can you add your pasta to your compost? All righty. And then traditional composting has a very heavy reliance on the 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen ratio. So it is a very brown, heavy composting technique, which means you've got to have access to those different brown sources, which brings us to our next slide. So I have starred some of my personal favorites because they're easily accessible to me. And so as you take a look at the list, they might also be easily accessible to you. Maybe something else shines as something that you can use as a carbon source. And so my favorites are dried leaves. And then for dried leaves, what we do at our home is that at the end of the growing season, we stop mulching and we just kind of let the leaves settle in. We also cover some of our more delicate perennials with those leaves and then kind of, insulate them from what could be a harsh winter. And in the spring, then, after everything starts to melt and it becomes obvious that our pollinators are waking up, then what I do is I collect those and kind of put them in one spot. And some of the pollinators that are late to arrive, they're still not getting mulched, they're just getting moved. And so they might be jostled awake, but we end up putting them all in one spot. And then as I need them, I can just go into the woods. I can grab my pile of leaves and then bring them back to my compost pit. And so for me, dry leaves are huge. Another one is shredded paper. And a special note about Crow Wing County and our recycling infrastructure here is that we can't handle shredded paper very well because it falls through the sorter. And so that's one of the first steps with our recycling is to sort it, right? And shredded paper falls right through. And that makes shredded paper non-recyclable unless it is properly bagged. And so what we do is we skip all of that because if it's not going to be effectively recycled, then we can feed it to our worms or put it in our compost as our carbon source. And so that makes a really nice carbon source. And then another one is cardboard. Of course, gotta be smart about that. The cardboard that is heavily waxed or printed is not necessarily a good source unless, of course, that can be taken apart. And another thing is that it should be broken into small strips, and that's just so that it has an easier time composting. You want some structure there, and so you want to rip it into the small strips, and you can even make it into little balls or whatever and put it within your compost. And then for us, I have three little boys at home. We fly through paper towels and napkins. And it makes me feel terrible because I know where paper towels and napkins come from, right? And so this is a way that I feel a little bit less terrible. We still try and conserve our paper towels and napkins to must-use times, but paper towels and napkins for us go into our compost. All right. So special considerations for composting is that, like I mentioned, this is a spring activity. And so make sure that if this is something that you plan on doing, that you have everything ready to go and assembled as soon as spring hits. And so as soon as the ground thaws, it's just like, okay, I'm going to put my compost pit out, right? And so those are something that you don't want to wait until July to get started because chances are by August, when things are starting to cool down again, you're not going to have much for compost. And so there's a lot of different techniques as to how you can make a compost heap. It could be as simple as here is a spot in the back part of my lawn where I don't care if there's just this heap of stuff, right? Or it could be, a formation of pallets. It could be cinder blocks. For me, I have a rolling composter because my kids really enjoy it. And so we take the rolling composter off its base and then they roll it around the driveway, which is just a lot of fun. Um, and then the time, it usually takes for us at least 2 months here in Minnesota to get to it. And so it needs to start right away in the spring, right? Because July and August really isn't going to give a lot of time for that composting to break down. There are ways to get there, but it could take years or months to years depending on the amount of time you're willing to put into that heap. So my suggestion is to let the fall leaves sit. And that has a lot to do with the pollinators, and it has a lot to do with, the composting technique. It starts without any type of input from us. And so it will start to degrade underneath the snow and start to feed the lawn. And so you've got this really great uh, beginning for decomposition taking place right under the snow. And then you just gather it all up and you're ready to go. And as I alluded to, there are ways to speed up the process. And this is just a standard microbe. It's a compost accelerator, but effectively what it is a whole bunch of microbes that are specialized in breaking things down. And that's it. And you sprinkle it on top of your compost pile and they do the work. And so there's no added chemicals to it. It is literally just microbes.
It's natural.
Yes.
Nikki, as long as there's nobody else here.
Yeah.
If you want to skip part of this, I'm a big, I don't mean to interrupt you here.
Yeah.
But, like I say, nobody else except me is.
Right. So it's the recording part though.
Oh.
So.
Like I say, I'm big into this, and afterwards,
yeah.
I'll tell you some of my good tips.
Cool.
Because I'm 82 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm an old organic gardener.
Yep.
And so, I mean, I can add to so much of this
right.
stuff, and nobody else is listening. So if you can.
But we do have people online. So but we are almost to the end of this part. So
because I'm the only person here.
Yeah, no, we're good. All right. So then the other question then is, well, what kind of bin do you want? So like I had mentioned, it might be a heap. You might actually just put it in a bin, or it could be in a rolling bin. All right, so then the question becomes, well, what do you do at the end of the growing season? Because you're not going to be able to add materials without introducing things like critters, for instance. They love those nice warm compost heaps. And not to mention, if you're adding materials, they're not going to be composting anyway. So what I suggest is indoor composting, which brings us to our first major technique of Bokashi. And so Bokashi fermentation is effectively just pickling your peels. So this is an anaerobic decomposition reaction. Once again, anaerobic refers to without air. So without aerobic air. And a lot of the research that has been done about Bokashi fermentation pertains to the industrial process for gas production, in particular methane. And so this is Bokashi fermentation has been in existence far before any of the industrial practices for methane collection. But it's pretty cool because there is a financial investment to understand these processes more, which are then directly applicable for residential composting, which is just, I think, really, really neat. So the process starts with hydrolysis. So once again, hydro meaning water, lysis to break. And then another set of microbes are responsible for acidogenesis, acido meaning acid, genesis meaning creation. And so all of these food products or whatever is being composted is acidified, right? And so then the next step is acetogenesis. And so aceto referring to acetic acid or acetate, and then genesis being the creation. And so our acidified product is then acetofied. And then that final step would be the generation of methane, and that's through methanogenesis. And so each one of these processes are taking place or occur because of a specialized subset of microbes. And so once again, emphasis on the fact that this is the industrial process. In our home composting, we don't want to go all the way down to that last tidbit because we don't want to be generating methane within our home, which is really cool because we can stop it. And so once we hit the acetogenesis, the big thing is to make sure that we just don't have the the bacteria that produce methane present, right? And so if you control what bacteria are present within your anaerobic fermentation bin, then we don't generate methane. We generate a whole bunch of other things, but not methane. And so Bokashi fermentation uses what's known as effective microorganisms. And so this is a live culture of microbes. And so that's this right here. I'll give that to you if you want to take a look at it while I'm continuing the chat. And this includes a really cool assortment of bacteria. So one of which that I talked about before is the lactic acid bacteria. And so this would be like lactobacillus. And so these are bacteria that are similar to, if not the same, as what's used in yogurt production. And so these have a specialized ability to process carbs, proteins, and fats. They're incredible, and they can break down all of those. And so this is above and beyond what is capable of within like an aerobic setting, like our worms and our heaps. And then we have the photosynthetic bacteria, and these are purple bacteria. And this produces food like amino acids, nucleic acids, and sugar, in particular for the lactic acid bacteria. And so the purple bacteria are helping out the lactic acid bacteria, which are then helping out the purple bacteria. And so we have this really nice synergy that is taking place. And then third, we have yeasts. And so on that original slide where I pointed out all of the different microbes that are present, yeasts are there. And they're not bacteria, they're their own set of organisms, and they complement the bacterial processes. And these are the big producers and secretors of enzymes that help break down our compost. And then we have actinomycetes, and this is another type of bacteria. They break down complex macromolecular structures. And so from our talk last week, we talked about what some of those structures look like. We have amylose, which is a pretty simple plant starch, amylopectin, which is a more complex branched starch, and then we have cellulose. And the cellulose is the one that is the most challenging to break down because it forms these really compact tubular structures where it takes a lot of effort and time to break them down from the outside all the way into the inside. So actinomycetes do an incredible job of breaking down all of those more complicated um, carbohydrates that are present within our composted material. All right, and so anaerobic without air means that we need an airtight bin. So if you end up taking a look over here, and people online, I'll show you in just a moment, we have a makeshift Bokashi bin. It doesn't require anything fancy. You can buy them commercially online. I have yet to see any of them locally in any of our gardening stores or big box stores. It's not something that's really taken off. But it is pretty easy to make. And so on the bottom, and let's see if I can, I don't think I can take over. Yep, no, I can't take over right now. And so on the bottom, my husband 3D printed a platform that goes inside a beverage dispenser that we picked up from Walmart. And then we set all of our composted materials up on top of that so that we can dispose of the flow through. And the flow through is just something that we don't want to use for anything. It goes down into our septic tank, actually, where it does the job in our septic tank too. And so it works really nice. And then one other important thing is because this is anaerobic, a important note is that you really should use fluoride-free water. And the reason for that isn't anything to do with, like fluoride treatment in your teeth and the controversy around that. It has to do with the fact that you don't want to be generating fluoride gases. And so with these bacteria at work, you don't want to be adding fluoridated water to the bin because you don't want to be generating fluoride gases. It's that also relates to last week's presentation. We talked a bit about the fluoride gases. All right, and then another thing that you are going to need is the Bokashi bran, which you just took a look at. That's what that's called. And that Bokashi bran is made up of starch, sugar, and water, once again, fluoride free, and the EM1, so the effective microorganisms one. It's just a commercially available assortment of microbes. And this could be homemade or purchased. And so you still need to buy the microbes, but you can actually make your own brand to be then adding into your Bokashi bin. All right, so how do we do Bokashi? All right, so first step is to assemble the bin. So for this, I am going to bring this over and um, it is not showing properly because it just wants to see me. All right, so In this picture, then, what we are looking at is effectively what I have sitting next to me. So up at the very top, we have an airtight lid. I have an additional grocery bag on it because I want to make sure that, and it is secured by a rubber band. It's just an extra attempt to minimize any type of air infiltration. And then you can skip that if you want. And then what you do is you have your platform. And so you need your platform at the bottom. And then you add something that all of your compostable material can sit on. And so for me, that was shredded paper. And so the shredded paper isn't going to, fall down through the cracks on the platform. All right, so then you add some bran in your carbon. Once again, that for me would end up being shredded paper. And so I added some Bokashi bran on top of my paper, and then I kind of patted it in, made sure that it was nice and moist. All of the extra water just ran on through to the bottom. And then for me, I like to puree my food scraps because the smaller those food scraps are, the easier they are to digest. And so I puree them in an old blender jar and add some of that Bokashi bran. And then I put that up on top. And then you need some sort of press. And so for me, that's usually compostable paper plate. And then I just push it down and squeeze out all the air. Because once again, this is a process that doesn't use air. And then spend a little bit of time, get a napkin or a used paper towel and scrape down the sides to make sure that we don't have anything extra that's sitting up on the sides because this is, there is a little bit of air in this until it is consumed. And then it's virtually an anaerobic environment again. And then last step is then to close the lid and empty the tea. And so it's a pretty easy thing. Once it becomes full, then you basically just wait. You watch to make sure that the fluid isn't too high. You drain it when it is. You make sure that it stays closed. And after 3 to 4 weeks of that fermentation process, then you can take it outside and bury it. You can keep it in its bin until it's thawed out outside and bury it, or you can feed it to the worms. And so for all those that are online, this is what my setup looks like. And so we have that platform. We have the tea, which is on the bottom, which we just dispose right down into our septic system. We have the bran with our first level of carbon right here. Then we have miscellaneous scrap. And so this picture was taken way back by Thanksgiving, and this was something that was super exciting. So we had like coffee and peel and brands, and so traditional composted goods, right? But then on top of that, I made a bone broth from our turkey, and so I pressure cooked the bone broth, and took the bones and ground them down. And so what we have kind of up on the top is what was left from our Thanksgiving turkey, and so those are all of the bones, and they got a couple extra scoops of the bran to help break them down. And then at the very top, you'll notice that I do have quite a bit of condensation, which for me was an indicator that things are actually taking place. All right. And so when we go through and we use Bokashi, we actually keep a on the counter bin where we collect all of our stuff before we blend it and put it into the Bokashi bin because you want to limit the number of times that you open it. And so this is something where we only open our Bokashi bins once every like 3 or 4 days. And then if there is something that needs to go in the bin that's not able to sit on the counter, then we also have a space inside our refrigerator where we can get rid of that. Um, and let's see. Um, a personal story. So my first attempt at Bokashi was an absolute epic failure. And I tried the stacked uh, bucket. So there's a whole bunch of different DIY ways that we can do Bokashi, and I tried the stacked bucket. And the issue with using buckets is that you can't see what's going on inside, right? And so I had this whole thing where, we'd add the waste, we'd push it down, we'd close the top, and then we'd let it sit. And then we'd add the waste, we'd push it down, we'd close the top and let it sit, right? But what ended up happening is that I didn't know when I had introduced contamination, and I ended up putrefying it. and it stunk to high heaven. We buried out in the middle of the woods. It was absolutely positively foul. But it was an experiment, and for me, it drove me nuts because I didn't know exactly where things went wrong because I couldn't see it. And so for me, the important first step and the reason that we didn't get a commercial bin was because I wanted to be able to see what was going on so that that didn't happen again. So with a transparent bin, you can actually see the process that is taking place. And also because there are photosynthetic bacteria in there, they also like light. And so they don't want to be in oxygen, but they like the light. And so it's this really cool way to be able to have them be part of the process effectively. And so, yeah, so ultimately ended up getting rid of those buckets. They're now our rock collecting buckets. And so we put rocks in there and we can wash them off because they've got all the drainage holes and all that kind of stuff. So we were able to reuse those buckets in a different way. But yeah, so now everything for us is completely see-through. That way, if something goes bad, we can catch it right away. Um, all right, so then we'll move on to our last major technique, which is vermiculture. So, play worms play, work worms work. We are a big Dr. Seuss family in our house, so I couldn't help myself. All right, so this is our worm bin at the end of fall, and you'll see that as I'm pulling through, you can kind of see what those worm castings look like. You can see that I pick out those worms. The worms, I think, are pretty happy. They look pretty happy, and you can see that I even have something growing out of my compost bin. It's not unusual. But yeah, that's our worm bin, and it sits out by my garden. Here I am squishing the composted material. It's just like really sponge-like, which is the ideal for vermiculture. And so vermiculture is a combination technique. It is still microbial driven, but the worms are doing the job of the aeration. And so they're the worms that are making the little tunnels and keeping everything nice and light and fluffy. And this type of composting uses very specific worms. It's not something that you can just go into your backyard, flip the dirt, and grab your night crawlers. Those are the wrong types of worms. They might be able to do the job, just not as effectively as actual composting worms. And so the two major worms both belong to the Icenia species. And so these are the red wigglers, so Icenia fetida, and the European night crawler, which is Icenia hortensis. Um, and then these worms are especially effective at breaking down organic waste into nutrient-rich castings. And what's really neat is some early research indicates that they're also effective at breaking down organopesticides as well as pharmaceuticals. And so there is still a chance here that worms have a very important place within our cleaning up of our landfills in particular. Another really cool thing about worms is that they come with a very earthy smell. And so, like, when we think about the smell of the rain, when the rain comes and you have this really beautiful smell, it comes with a very similar smell. And so it's just like the turned dirt. So it makes it really nice for indoor composting because there's an earthy smell that comes with it, not one that's, foul or anything with like that. And so in my opinion, it makes it great for apartments, classrooms, or homes with limited outdoor space. We do worms inside our home during the winter, and then they get moved outside for the summer, just because then it's really easy to go and grab the compost. So a worm starter pack looks something like this. So over on the table, I have our commercially purchased worm bin. We have two. We have a homemade uh, version and a commercial version. The commercial version we purchased because it was smaller than our homemade one, and it's a lot easier to move around. And so each of them are going to be relatively similar, though. At the very bottom, you have a collection space for the worm tea. And this type of tea you can actually use when diluted to fertilize your plants, which is pretty cool. You don't want to do that with Bokashi. Wrong kind of tea. But it does have to be diluted because it is really potent. And then you have a stacking bin system. And worms don't have to be in a stacking bin, but it does speed up the process, especially later on. And so you'll need some sort of bin, plastic or wooden. It's going to need air holes, and so those are represented there, and some sort of drain. So you need to be able to drain that tea off. And then worms require bedding. And so this is something that's carbon rich. So that can be our newspaper, our cardboard, or my personal favorite is coconut coir. And so it's a waste product that gets put to really good use. The worms really like being in it, and it does a great job of holding water. And then, of course, you're going to need worms. And in deciding how many worms a person should order, you need to know that worms can eat between 25 and 50% of their body weight of food per day. And so, depending on how much food scrap you're generating, will kind of impact how many worms you'll need. Another important thing is that worms do reproduce over time. And so they'll kind of end up at their ideal level. And then, of course, food scraps for me, once again, we blend them, and that has a lot to do with breaking down the surface area for composting because you have two processes that are taking place at the same time. One, you have traditional composting, and then you have two, the worms actually coming through and breaking down those food products as well. And an ideal temperature, and the reason why we compost inside our home during the winter, is because the ideal temperature for the Eisenia type of worms is 55 to 75 or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So in our garage, it's just too cold. Obviously, outside, it's way too cold. But then during the summer, we're mostly at the right temperature, especially when we keep it in the shade. So my mom is a rock star, and um, she encourages me in all of these what seems to be pretty silly adventures. And so for my birthday, several years ago now, she made me a worm bin out of cedar. And it was just scrap. It was lying in the back. And so, put the pieces together, right? The drawback being that it is heavy. And so it's one of those things that as it gets filled up, it's actually really heavy to handle. And so we try and deal with it once. And so the worms start out in the bottom, and then we're adding our next level, and then we fill it up, and then we add our next level, and then we fill it up. And then at the end of the season, then everything goes into our garden spaces. And so when I got started, this is what I got started with. So this was a homemade worm bin. And then I purchased my worms online because once again, it's not something that I'm aware that we have any access to from like our garden centers or our big box stores. You can find the Eisenia type of worm through Fleet Farm as a bait worm. The red wrigglers are, in fact, a bait worm. And so that is one type of worm. But once again, having a diverse population of worms will also help with the composting because those worms prefer different things. And so it's a really neat way to have worm diversity within your bin. All right, and then a important note as a master gardener, we can't talk about worms without talking about jumping worms. And so this is also part of why it's really important to go through a reputable worm dealer because a reputable worm dealer will have a reputation for dealing with a specific type of worm. We don't want to introduce jumping worms. Not in Minnesota. They are absolutely destroying different ecosystems because they are ravenous. And it is a completely non-ideal worm for a worm bin. They will do the job, but also at the detriment of wherever you end up putting those worm castings if you don't first make sure that the worms are out of those castings. So yeah, so there is a drawback there. So make sure that whomever you are dealing with has a long and rich history of making sure that the worms that they are selling are in fact what they say they are. All right, so then what goes into a worm bin is very similar to what can go into a heap. And so um, if I could bring your attention over to the no side, that includes things like cooked foods, cheese and dairy, meat and bones, as well as skip down to used tissues and paper towels. So used tissues and paper towels have a lot to do with worm sensitivity. So their skin is very delicate. Depending on what's on your used paper towels, you could run the risk of harming your worms. So if you're using paper towels to clean, those cleaning agents can really, really ruin those worms. But what is really cool is cooked foods, cheese and dairy, meat and bones, and then those paper towels are all a really great fit for Bokashi. All right. So, in getting this set up, first step is to get your bin, no matter what you decide to do. You can buy it commercially. That's the easiest. You can build it yourself. And then you add your bedding, moisten it like a wrung out sponge. Add your worms and your scraps, and then bury new scraps under the bedding. And that has a lot to do with the fact that you just don't want to introduce any food smells. And so if it stays underneath the bedding, those smells are all but eliminated. And then empty the tea. That is a liquid fertilizer when diluted, or you can just dump it into your septic system or, outside on your plants if it's summertime. And then finally, the last step is to harvest your compost. And that also takes about 2 to 3 months. And what's cool about the stacked system is that after 2 to 3 months, those worms have migrated out. And so it is actually relatively safe to use the composted castings at the very bottom without any type of treatment because you're very unlikely to introduce worms because worms lay eggs, right? And so the Icenia fetida has about 30 days for worms to hatch, and Hortensis has about 40 to 50 days to hatch. And so then once those worms hatch, they migrate right on up to where the food is, right? And once all of the food has been digested down in the lowest part of the bins, they're going to move up through those drainage holes. And so it's just a really elegant way to get the worms to move out and decrease the likelihood of introducing worms that you may not want inside your garden because we should never really intentionally add worms to a different space. All right, so a quick detour. This is not quite composting, but this is a food recycler, and it is an electric way to handle food scraps. And the way that this works is that it uses high temperature to first desiccate the food and then neutralize the pathogens. And so this is something that just sits on your counter. And let's say that you've got some food waste. It doesn't matter. It can be chicken bones. It can be any of the small bones. You can't do a big one like I did with the turkey, but you can do small bones. You can put those in there. Any type of food waste can goes in, and then it just grinds, desiccates and grinds, desiccates and grinds. And the benefit of something like this is that it's really easy to use year round. And although this isn't the true, authentic microbial driven compost, it is something that can then be very easily digested by microbes. And so it's been effectively neutralized. Oh, and then I say no bones. It can actually handle small bones, but not like the big bones. You don't want to put like a beef bone in there. That won't handle it very well. But the drawback is that it is an incomplete decomposition. And then there is also a large upfront cost that is required with purchasing the instrument. So usually these start at about $250. But then there's also the maintenance cost and then the electricity cost that comes with it. And so it may not be a good fit for everyone. All right, so moving on, let's talk about putting everything together. And so, personally, as a scientist, personally, as a human being, I love Queen and I love the I Want It All song. And so, as it pertains to composting, I wanted it all. And so I did. I took on that adventure. And what I found out is when we moved to Pequot Lakes, there was already a heap in existence, and it wasn't for me. It's just, I did not want to get out there and I did not want to get a pitchfork. I did not want to have to turn the stuff. That wasn't for me. Farming Nikki is not a very good person. And so I got a tumbling bin composter, and it just so happens that my kids absolutely love it. But what I did notice is as I was going through this composting and learning more and more about what you can and cannot compost, is that I did not appreciate that there was this limited input. I couldn't do hot peppers because of the different things that are present in hot peppers. I couldn't do orange peels because of the acid. Couldn't do onions because of the sulfur. And so all of these things that seemed like they would be compostable were in fact not compostable. And so I'm just like, okay, well, let's try and figure this out. Another tidbit too is that even when I started composting, it took too much time. And so I couldn't use it until midway through the growing season. And by then it's just like, well, some of my stuff is already done. Like, what? Why? Right? And so for me, we still have a tumbling bin composter, but the way that we use it is a little bit different. And so after that, that's when I became really enthusiastic about vermiculture. So I purchased mine online, and I supplemented my worms with the red wrigglers that I had mentioned. I picked up mine from Fleet Farm. But then I still had foods that could not go in to the worm bin, and still had additional food waste that we otherwise couldn't process. And so we got chickens, but unfortunately here they don't really play a part in our composting story outside of the fact that they do a great job of eating our scraps, and then, they fertilize as they wander. They're free range, and so they do their thing. But then I became really excited about this anaerobic technique of Bokashi fermentation. And this emphasis, again, is not putrefaction. But when doing this, you really kind of have to think of this as a sauerkraut, kimchi, or fermented pickle type technique. You don't want to introduce air to it. But this one, in my opinion, is also a little bit higher effort, and it requires a little bit more skill and a high tolerance for trial and error. Because just like I shared with my story, people may get it right the first time, and by all means, like, I applaud that. But I didn't. And so you have to have a tolerance in any type of composting for trial and error and finding what works in your particular situation. And then the drawback with Bokashi is that it does require soil incubation to neutralize those acids. Unless, of course, you feed it to the worms. And I can happily report that we have gone through one 5-gallon bin of Bokashi and fed our worms with it. And our worms do, in fact, love it. And so it's pretty cool. And then the benefits of composting are incredible. It improves the bioavailable nutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, also known as NPK, that a lot of gardeners are familiar with. It also introduces beneficial microbes. And this has a lot to go, or it has a big story to play as it pertains to pathogenic microbes. So think about the ones that wipe out tomatoes, potatoes, the blights, right? So the idea is by introducing beneficial microbes, we can outcompete those pathogenic microbes. And so improving soil diversity of microbes can help reduce the occurrence of plant pathogens. And we'll talk on that in, I think, 2 weeks. And then compost also helps improve the soil structure and water retention. And so plants are less likely to dry out between waterings when properly composted. And then, generally speaking, compost is a safe and gentle way to fertilize plants, especially as compared to commercial fertilizers that have a reputation of, burning the plants. And so compost, you generally don't have that particular concern. And then I just kind of wanted to share, this is what my coat closet looks like in the winter. So you can see over on the left side, we got the worms. Over on the right side, we've got the kashi. And that's just, it makes it easy because all I have to do is walk about 15 feet from our kitchen to our coat closet and take care of the composting. I don't know if our worms and compost will ever leave that space now because I've really become accustomed to having it so close. It's a heck of a lot easier than having to walk all the way outside to the other side of the garden to feed the worms. Um, all right, so let us then quickly go through troubleshooting. And so, troubleshooting a compost heap. So, one of the biggest drawbacks is, well, maybe nothing is happening. That could be because things are too dry. Maybe it's too cold. Maybe the microbes just haven't kicked off yet. And so, a pretty straightforward way to remedy that is to dampen it or heat it up. And so during the early spring, that could be something as easy as putting a big black tarp over top of it to try and get the heap uh, the heap heated up. Wow. And then another thing is to add microbes. There's nothing wrong with adding some microbes to it instead of relying on just the ones that are naturally present. Another issue that a person might face with compost heap is that it is stinky. And that generally means that there is something putrefying in there. And so, for that, the most simple, straightforward thing that a person can do is to get in there and aerate it. Look for the offender. It's going to be slimy and gross. Remove it, bury it, dispose of it, do whatever you want with it. Just don't put it back in your compost heap, right? And then another big thing is to add a carbon source. So go and find some shredded cardboard, some leaves, or some paper. Really get that mixed in there. And so one last thing, again, add some microbes. And so if you've got putrefaction happening, it might just be that you don't have enough of the good bacteria yet. So add some and then dampen it back down again. And then if it's incomplete, you're just trying to harvest it too early. And so go ahead, aerate it, wait. If this is I need this now, you can always sift it and then continue composting any of the big particles out of that or that didn't make it through the sifting technique. And once again, always could add some microbes. All right, so moving on to our Bokashi bin. All right, well, if your bin smells, I'm sorry to tell you, but your bin is most likely open. There's some sort of air leak because Bokashi should not smell at all unless, of course, you open it. And there are times when you will have to open it and it will smell, and it will not smell like fermented pickles. It is a much more offensive smell, but not so bad as something that is putrefied. My kids, they don't love it. And then you also need to consider emptying your Bokashi tea because if that tea ends up rising all the way to the bottom and then continues to grow up into what you're trying to compost, we do end up pushing that away from fermentation into putrefaction. And so that I think is part of what happened with my lack of success, my first couple rounds of Bokashi. Um, if it doesn't smell like pickles, you're yeasty. It's maybe a little offensive. Um, if it's more or less neutral, then maybe we could try adding some more Bokashi bran to it because there is supposed to be a smell that's with it. And so add some Bokashi bran and wait. But if it is absolutely, positively can't stand the smell of this foul, then there's probably something else growing, which means that you're going to have to take a look. For me, it's pretty easy because I've got a transparent bin. I know that there is nothing negative that's taking place right here. In fact, I know that there's some positive things that are growing in there because what you want to see is white inside your bin because those white microbes are the good microbes for a Bokashi bin. But if you see green or black, then you're going to have to end up making some decisions. So black or green mold is a bad set of microbes. And then that is an indicator that you do have contamination. So you have a choice. You can either scrape it and dispose of the contaminant. So get all of the black that you can out of there or all of the green, and then add some Bokashi brand to it and try and outcompete with the good bacteria. Or you could dig a big hole and toss it. So that's what we did with one of ours, and we're fortunate to be on, some acreage so that it's not disruptive to neighbors or anything like that. And just as a gentle reminder, open that bucket sparingly because the more times that we introduce air into the system, the more likely we are to push it towards putrefaction. And so it's a really delicate system. Once it's going, it does great work. But so yeah, troubleshooting a worm bin. All right, if your bin smells, there is a good likelihood that you have too much food, not enough air. This would be a good time to add some bedding. And so once again, worms even require a certain carbon ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio. If the worms are escaping, that means that there's something wrong with the environment. That could be that it's too wet, it might be too dry, it might be too hot. Or there could be a contaminant within your bin. So we talked about the disinfectants. Worms really don't like disinfectants. They also don't like onions or citrus peels. They hurt the skin. If there's fruit flies, that's something that kind of comes with having a worm bin. But if you have a full-on infestation, make sure that you're burying the food. That's one of the easiest things that a person can do. If there's slime, that means that something putrefied. It might need to be drier in there. Add some more carbon, add some worms. Uh, Find a way to help them aerate their own space. It also might indicate that there was a contamination. Maybe a cheese stick accidentally ended up inside your worm bin, right? And then there's always the option of adding some microbes to it because remember, even vermiculture is microbial driven. And then this was a fun one for me. I had a mysterious case of shrinking worms. And that's when I learned that worms too have a certain carbon requirement. It may not be as high as traditional heap composting, but they also need carbon in order to grow nice and big. And in the event that you're adding too much food waste and not enough carbon, then what will end up happening is they'll continue to shrink and shrink and shrink. And it's not actually that they're shrinking, but they're not growing to their full size. And so they'll stay really small and then they'll die and then they'll reproduce and they'll die, but they never get to be really big worms. And so you've got to add some more carbon to it. And so with that, that is kind of the end. So we covered a whole host of different things. Next week, we'll be talking about choosing seeds and seed starting.